Very good. So, good afternoon and welcome to this panel discussion on a new agenda for global health. We all realize that the goal of WHO, Health for All, is far from being reached. The Millennium Development Goals, or MDG, showed in MDG 2030 that the disease panorama is changing all the time. Hence, we need to change the strategy to reach the goals. This panel is going to discuss the nature of a new agenda for global health. We have gathered here today an outstanding group of leaders with a background from many different areas. They will identify elements of a new agenda for global health. And I'll introduce them. I have here to my right, Mikael Dolsten. Dr. Dolsten is the president of Pfizer Worldwide Research and Development and executive vice president of Pfizer. Prior to joining Pfizer, Dr. Dolsten was president of Wyeth Research. His earlier career as pharmaceutical research leader included Boehringer Ingelheim, AstraZeneca, and Pharmacia and Upjohn. Dr. William Hait, or Bill Hait, is global head of Janssen R&D, the global R&D arm of the pharmaceutical companies of Johnson & Johnson. And prior to joining J&J, he was the founding director of the Cancer Institute of New Jersey and professor of medicine and pharmacology at the New Jersey Robert Wood Johansson Medical School. And next person on the podium is Bernard Kouchner. Dr. Kouchner is a French politician and physician. He's a co-founder of Doctors Without Borders and of Doctors of the World. He has been Minister of Health 3 times and Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he was also the head of the UN Interim Administration mission in Kosovo. He has just returned from Africa. And finally, Elias Zerhouni. Dr. Zerhouni has been professor and chair of the Department of Radiology at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, where he also served as executive vice dean. In 2002, Dr. Zerhouni was appointed director of the National Institutes of Health, and Dr. Zerhouni convened a series of meetings to chart a roadmap for medical research in the 21st century in order to identify major opportunities and gaps in biomedical research. Since 2011, he's president of Global Research and Development at Sanofi. So we will start with Dr. Kouchner, and who will focus on Ebola. Please.
Easy. Very easy to start. Well, I'm very honored to be part of such a prestigious panel, but I have to talk about reality. I'm coming back from Africa. Don't rush away. In fact, you're sort of a suspect if you're coming from Africa. And I want to tell you the reality of what I discovered, because I'm certainly very proud as a founder of Doctors Without Borders. More than proud. It was 45, 47 years ago, 71. But the fact is that I discovered in the 3 countries, African countries, Guinea-Conakry, Sierra Leone, and Liberia, since the beginning, that is to say, since January, because we were very slow to react, since January, only the teams of Médecins Sans Frontières were there working. And they are really courageous and very efficient people. So my first, let's not say conclusion because it's impossible to conclude right now, but my first feeling is that the first victory of Ebola virus is to panic the people, especially in the countries where there is no epidemic. And I just want to underline that in Africa, between certainly 10,000 or 11,000 of cases were absolutely unknown by the people panicking right now. Like if, sorry to say, they were not patients, they were not men or women, they were just African. That's the fact. Including in France, of course. I'm not talking about United States of America. I'm talking about all the rich countries. So we have lost a lot of time, not only because it has started, the epidemic around January, a bit before, but we were not interested on the research on Ebola virus, even if we knew that it has come at the beginning, and certainly before. But at the beginning, the first epidemic in the République démocratique, as you say, the Congo, in 75, 76, then after. But we were not interested to work on and to try to get a vaccine at the beginning, because it was an African disease for African people. I call that racism, or partly racism, at least. And so, in fact, we had the same reaction, that is to say, to stay inert, when HIV/AIDS came. Remember, we used to stigmatize the people, homosexual, from Africa to Haiti, etc., etc. And we have lost in that time months and years. And it was the same thing in Ebola. So we reacted first in refusing to see the reality. Then some crew, including the French Air France crew, etc., we stopped delivering our passenger, and we closed our airport in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, not yet in Guinea. It was our first reaction, a sort of spiritual and a sort of quarantine in your mind. I understand that this is a real story. I understand, but let me tell you the data, very elementary data. In Guinea-Conakry, where my good people, Médecins Sans Frontières team is working in the middle of a very dirty and broken hospital of Dunka, under tents, just protected by a little plastic red ribbon. In reality, as you know perfectly, we have no treatment against the Ebola disease. But just taking care of the symptoms, in between 50 to 60% of the patients inside the hospital of Doctors Without Borders are safe. So this is not true that this is a mortal, of course this is mortal for 40%, 45, etc. But this is not true to say that just by contact you will die. not at all. So I don't want to be very long, but this is a real, let's say, this is not only the story of an epidemic, or it was the story of the pandemic for HIV/AIDS. This is the story of globalization. This is the story of rich people against the poor people. Not only, it would be childish to consider that this is only that aspect of the disease. But you will certainly talk, and rightly, about the progress, because you will see progress will be made very quickly. And certainly the first one should be this quick test with a little drop of blood on the finger. Certainly in the coming weeks. Maybe months, but certainly I hope so in the coming weeks. And it will change everything. I have here, and I cannot give you all the details, but the emergency plan of Guinea, they had nothing. And Guinea, remember, was under dictatorship during 55 years. But in the dictatorship, at the beginning of the dictatorship, it was Sékou Touré. And Sékou Touré was a Marxist. And so he has the interest also, partly, to develop, some hospital in the countries and some dispensary, and there was a little network of health. It was not enough, it was roughly nothing, but well, something. In Liberia and Sierra Leone, they were, and they are still, just out of the war, which destroyed completely the countries and the health infrastructures. So nothing. They were reacting from scratch, from nothing. So, to tell you the truth, we have to, it's a difficult word, but to use or to benefit of Ebola disease to reinforce their structures. That is to say, from the beginning, the capital, yes, the two hospitals, very, very, very elementary hospital. But to take the blood, the samples from the raining forest. The raining forest, this is the forest like 3,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago. This is impossible to cross by. And of course, as all in between Sierra Leone and Liberia and the other, it was colonization borders. The colonization border was cutting in that time all the families in 2 pieces or 3 pieces. But they know how to cross the border. This is impossible to send them gendarmerie and soldiers. This is just useless. If they want to cross the border, they cross the border. But the main thing is that with the samples I was talking about, you have to take what? The road, because there are no helicopter. To go to the capital, Conakry, to test. So to isolate a patient, before isolating a patient, because that is not because I was against quarantine and the idea of quarantine. Quarantine around Africa with a wall, why not? No, you have to convince the people that you are coming as a doctor or as a medical staff. This is impossible to come like a Martian, you know, with your very strange uniform and to take a child or to take a part of the family without explaining to the people. Okay, explaining to the people, but the reality is that that particular forest, this is Malinke language, but inside the Malinke language, 23 different languages should be more or less not learned, but you have to work with the people. You have to work with the local people. And that is very difficult because the threat was so high. So it was so difficult to let them understand that we were, I mean, Doctors Without Borders at the beginning, another time they were alone. They were coming to calm down the situation and to take care of the patients. So some of the teams were shut down. Okay, I don't want to threaten you, but in fact, the reaction of our countries, because I'm talking about the US people and the French people, was good. Too late, too slow, not enough, but good. The American people are sending 3,000 soldiers in Liberia. What for? I don't know, because it will be very difficult. To mitigate the people and to be really efficient. But well, this is a good reaction. But after, we also have to teach, not after, right now, to teach our people. This is not a touristic travel, you know. I have to maintain absolutely the security of these people. But this is not so difficult, but we have to explain. Second, in Sierra Leone, an hospital in Liberia also, but I remember there is a big hospital in Monrovia called Joseph Kennedy Hospital. Huge building. So we'll certainly take care of that. In Sierra Leone, the Brits are sending an hospital and some volunteers also. And in Guinea, we are in charge, the French, with an hospital. But they want, just I want to finish because otherwise it is too sad. But the beginning of the emergency plan is immediate delivered by an air bridge, of course. Where's the air bridge? 10 centers of advanced treatment. 10 centers of advanced treatment. If you ask these people, of the advanced treatment will be delivering a capacity of 100 beds, laboratory, and of course, comment on dit une morgue déjà? Morgue. Ouais. J'aurais dû m'en douter. And 20 beds in the lab and on the morgue, a sort of communitary transit with also 10 beds, formation with a capacity of a training of 50 persons, and another training center. To set up that, only the first line of the emergency plan. It will take efforts, money, okay, but money, we have that now. I think that in between the World Bank and the European Union and the American efforts and etc., they have the money. But how to spend the money? How to use it? And last word, at least 10 people, certainly very good people, certainly highly, let's say.
So maybe we should see if we have some.
No, but you need for such an emergency plan. We are used to 45 of that experience. We need a leader. In one country, certainly, so you make 3 leaders. And you need the minimum for the 3, another person to harmonize the whole thing. And I think that all this person coming from European Union, from the UN, from WHO, from everybody, it will be much more complicated. The second danger in an emergency is the people in charge of rescue. Thank you very much.
Okay, so do we have any questions from, yes, please.
Thank you.
On the ground, conducting the treatment, recognize how difficult the conditions are. But if we think of Walter Reed some years ago dealing with yellow fever or with Japanese encephalitis virus, another medical threat that currently is undertreated, are there technologies that need to be transferred into these countries to allow people to produce therapeutics on a local level? 100 years ago here in the States, that would have been the production of Antisera. These are technologies that are well established, can be used at a very low level of investment, and can be produced at the local level. Are there technologies that need to be going in to develop therapeutics as well as people to deliver therapy?
The answer is yes, but not now. Certainly the technology should be offered, and certainly they have some very good academics, and certainly they have some very good doctors, and including researchers. But this is not the emergency. As I told you, your question is very good. That's the way you answer to when you don't know how to answer to a question. Yes, a good question. So we have to use this opportunity, so-called opportunity, I'm very sorry for the word, but the opportunity to offer a new system of health. It means social welfare system. Where is the money from? Huh? Second, it means a chain of medical staff. You know how is gaining the monthly salary of a medical doctor in Guinea. This is $150 for the family. This is impossible. You cannot maintain your family with $150, even in Africa. So, of course, you are practicing not only in the public hospital, but in the private practice, etc. So this is too early to give them the technology, but certainly we also have to use the technology to be with them and to train them. And also, we should start a sort of reverse movement, asking the medical student to come largely in our countries to be trained in the same time. But the emergency is of course, to isolate for 4 days, 10 days, where you know exactly the cadency, the people, and to protect the rest of the family. So the emergency of the emergency is to talk and to re-establish confidence. But this is easy to say here, but very difficult to try to do so.
Thank you very much. I think we'll to proceed with Dr. Hait, who also will tell us something about drug development related to Ebola or vaccines. Please.
Thank you very much. I also want to congratulate and thank Dr. Kouchner for those efforts. They're extraordinary and against a huge problem. What I'm going to try to do in the next few minutes is to talk about how we at Janssen, the pharmaceutical companies of J&J, are trying to engage in the effort of global public health, and then say a word or two about Ebola as well. And these are the areas that I'm going to cover. And I think everyone has a mission. I think ours is perhaps as good as the next, but it's really to address those critical diseases, medical needs around the world. And we believe that global public health is the responsibility of great corporations. So we're building on a legacy of innovation, but more importantly on Paul Janssen's work on developing some of the early drugs for as anti-helminthics, as antifungals. He was quite a remarkable leader, developed 80 drugs. A recent article entitled "What the Biopharmaceutical Industry Can Learn from Apple" pointed to the 3 leading CEOs in the history of the pharmaceutical industry. One was Paul Janssen and one was Roy Vagelos, and both made a commitment to global public health. So to make it a reality and not just something we talked about, several years ago we established the Janssen Global Public Health Group that is 100% focused on these types of issues. And it spans research and development, sustainable access, and collaboration. And within these areas, we've asked the teams to focus down. In terms of treating and preventing disease, several focus areas. One is multi-drug resistant TB, which I'll talk about in a second, new treatments for neglected tropical diseases, long-acting treatments for HIV, and sexual transmission of HIV, and in the vaccine portion at the end, I'll also touch upon Ebola. So TB in this country is not viewed as an emergent type of problem, yet in the world it's actually a global health crisis. 8.6 million people have diagnosed with TB, 1.3 million die from TB, and the majority of newly diagnosed cases in many parts of the world is related to multi-drug resistant TB. And there hadn't been a new drug developed for multi-drug resistant TB in many, many years. Literally beginning with Paul Janssen, whose sister died of tuberculosis, began a search through phenotypic screening for a new drug to combat or to treat multi-drug resistant TB. This led to the discovery of bedaquiline, which is now marketed as Certuro. It works by a unique mechanism of action, which was only later deconvoluted to be the inhibition of an ATP synthase, and it's currently been granted accelerated approval in the US, and working with the World Health Organization and other collaborations around the world to develop the guidelines for using this drug appropriately so it remains active against resistant tuberculosis. In terms of neglected tropical diseases, we, as many others, signed the London Declaration of Neglected Tropical Diseases in 2012, which creates a multinational partnership, a multilateral partnership, to control 10 critical neglected tropical diseases. We're building again on areas that we had worked on in the past. So for example, flubendazole is a drug that really builds upon some of the work you heard about just a moment ago that Roy Vagelos and Merck had done for the treatment of river blindness. So flubendazole is being developed again to go after those patients who have not yet benefited from other therapies. And then Vermox or mebendazole to treat intestinal worms in young children, an enormous problem in certain areas of the world. Additionally, starting with Paul Janssen and Paul Stoffels, was the idea of getting drugs, one pill once a day to control HIV. And now moving to a next generation of HIV treatments with a long-acting injectable version of rilpivirine, a Janssen drug that will be used, we believe, to help with the treatment and maybe the prevention of spread of HIV as a convenient, perhaps, approach in the developing world. In terms of preventing sexual transmission of HIV, we're working in collaboration with the International Partnership for Microbicides to develop a vaginal microbicidal ring to use monthly to help prevent transmission, and we currently have a study ongoing where we will, in Africa, where we will enroll over 5,000 patients. None of this is possible without collaboration, and we've set up around the world innovation centers reaching out to organizations, academic, government, non-for-profits to help develop these solutions. Global public health at Janssen becomes our central point of contact. It's easier, we hope, for those interested in these areas to contact us within a relatively large and complicated company. And as I mentioned, several areas that we want to continue to develop through these collaborations is getting to children with HIV, disease management through mobile technologies, which will be incredibly important, perhaps in the Ebola problem we're seeing in Africa, ways of financing these things, and then working with government agencies on policies that will help. This is just some of the list of the collaborations that Janssen Global Public Health has set up. In terms of vaccines, our recent acquisition of Crucell program, and here we are committed to develop life-saving vaccines, monoclonal antibodies, and useful delivery technologies. Our goal is to supply affordable vaccines to the developing world and improve vaccine delivery to address many of these unmet needs. So some of the things that we are working on include vaccines for certain viruses. polio, hepatitis B, HIV, TB, and rabies, as well as bacterial diseases. And again, to do this correctly, we've created partnerships with organizations that can help gain access to these areas of the world that are not very simple and quite complex to do correctly. So right now we're working on Quinvaxin. It's a pentavalent vaccine, working with UNICEF, hitting 5 different serious childhood infectious diseases listed on this slide. In addition, creating new technologies to make it simpler and more convenient to utilize vaccines in different parts of the world, a Uniject system that we're developing in collaboration with Becton Dickinson. It simplifies delivery by combining a single-dose vaccine and a delivery device into one easy device to use. It's user and environment friendly, and it reduces waste. In terms of polio, using a Janssen technology, the Percy 6 cell line, very high yield to create vaccines. We believe this helps us rapidly develop large-scale production for vaccines around the world. Now let me get to Ebola. This picture, I don't know how well it projects, but to me it was one of the most heart-rending of pictures that I can see, a mother holding up her hands, watching her children die. We are committed, as you may have heard in a recent announcement, to joining the effort to create and deliver a vaccine to people in need. We're targeting, first off, the Zaire strain of Ebola virus, the one involved in the current problem. It's a prime boost regimen that in non-human primates against the most aggressive form of Ebola, we found 100% protection, and we're hopeful that this will translate into better protection for humans. The first in human testing will begin in January, and we're committed, if this is successful, to have 1 million doses available in 2015. Finally, we're working very hard on women's and children's initiatives through the Millennium Development Goals, and I won't go through all of the impact areas to say that this has the potential to affect over 120 million women and children a year by 2015. So to summarize, our goal at Janssen is to build on the strong legacy of innovation of Paul Janssen, our commitment to global public health, a complete focus by a 100% dedicated group with the goal of making a difference for patients and advance healthcare in society all over the world. Thank you.
The questions for Dr. Hait from the audience, from the panel. So where do we stand when it comes to drugs to treat Ebola?
Yeah. So I think that many companies, large and small, have an interest in filoviruses, the Marburg virus, the Ebola virus. There is reason to suspect that the polymerases that mediate replication of these viruses are druggable, and that using modern techniques of drug development, drug discovery, it's certainly feasible that there can be an antiviral agent developed that inhibits replication of this virus, and I hope in the not too distant future.
And how far away is it?
Well, I can't speak for all the pharmaceutical companies, only to say that the sooner the better would be, I think, the best we can do. Most of the ones that I'm familiar with are still in preclinical development.
Isn't there a more advanced partnered activity between NIH and some companies in near-term developing antibodies, right? It's therapeutics, but probably for more targeted populations like healthcare workers to improve access to difficult areas and secure good treatment for exposed individuals.
Right. So I think there's 2 efforts going on, one with the NIH, also with the Department of Defense, working on both small and large molecules. The question will be the efficacy of neutralizing antibodies. It's just too early to tell for sure, but these kinds of efforts that Michael mentioned are ongoing with a real sense of urgency.
Can people in Africa afford the drugs when they are available?
Yeah. No, I think I'm very proud to say that we've spent the last month intensely talking about Ebola and what we can do about it. And I can say absolutely with certainty the commercial aspects were never brought up once, and can be very, very proud of that. At some point, perhaps, but just like making Serturo available around the world for multi-drug resistant TB, this is the responsibility of a great corporation, and it's not one of the areas that we anticipate making a lot of money, or any money perhaps.
Okay. Any more questions? Then we'll proceed with the next presentation by Dr. Dolsten, and he will talk about the pharmaceutical industry is contributing to health for all by taking on the biggest killers that drive healthcare costs. We're changing track a little bit.
So thank you, Bengt. And I thought, as we discussed how the panel could expose different aspects of public health after the terrific presentation from Bill here, that it could be timely to broaden perspective of what is causing devastating mortality and morbidity across the globe. And first of all, reminding us that there are two main categories that we need to think about in a global perspective. The communicable diseases that Bill touched upon, and non-communicable diseases, or NCD as short. And when you look globally, it's noteworthy that the NCDs now cause almost 70% of mortality worldwide, and they are coming in groups such as cardiovascular or cerebrovascular diseases, myocardial infarction, stroke, cancers, particularly lung cancers, chronic lung disease, among those COPD and diabetes. And Bill spoke, I think, in an excellent way on the communicable diseases that affects all ages from maternal, neonate, infant, and adults. So also when you take a global perspective, there is a role for the pharmaceutical industry to think through with the proper stakeholders how we can develop medicines and vaccines that both can be used in the developed world but can find a way to be given access to low income and poor countries across the globe. And indeed, when you look at this large number of almost 70% of the global killers, and you look at those people that die from these diseases, 80% of the death occurs in low and middle income countries. And it's causing a devastating economical burden that impairs the ability of developing countries to grow their economy, improve life quality, and living standard in those societies, which is so critical in order to prevent also the communicable diseases. When we look at our efforts in the industry and academia together, vaccines has been a key tool to reduce disease burden. And it's noteworthy that today it's 100 years since Jonas Salk was born, who studied here at NYU initially at the medical school and was a kind of a founding father for the era of vaccines and polio. Since 1924, has prevented more than 100 million cases of childhood infections. And vaccines have saved 2.5 million lives each year, and especially related to children below 5 years of age. And on one hand, we have eradicated or made very rare a number of the threats that have been causing terrible concern in the world. On the other hand, there are remaining pathogens that cause tremendous difficult infections and affecting particularly in some cases young people or older adults. And as we heard about HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria causing tremendous suffering and mortality in the developing world, in many of those countries, pneumococcal disease actually as a single entity is a larger contributor to morbidity and mortality. And new rising threats, partly related to the excessive use of antibiotics to try and cope with some of the difficult infections, like Clostridium difficile, that in some countries is now rising as almost an epidemic in institutions and hospitalized environment and becoming extremely hypervirulent. Here in the United States, there's been recent alerts about meningococcal infections that strikes very quickly, cause almost within 24 hours death among oncologists. We have been engaged and have just in registration phase a vaccine that is aimed to preventing meningococcal B infection and provide protection for those that are in the adolescent age. I mentioned previously Clostridium difficile. Another devastating threat has been multi-resistant Staph aureus, where there is very few antibiotics left that can protect us. And here we also have taken action in having in clinical trials now an innovative vaccines for multi-resistant and Staph overall that could help us to prevent that difficult bacteria to spread. And there are lots of opportunities to think through how we can use modern scientific and technological advantage. And for example, neonatal infections, there are now opportunities to immunize the mothers, and we engage in programs to try and stop infections like beta-hemolytic strep, CMV, and RSV that can cause significant childhood mortality or disability for lifelong periods. So particularly I wanted to mention the work we have done on the Prevnar family of vaccines that covers now as many as 13 different bacterial serotypes, and it's now been developed in more than 90 countries and giving access to 1 out of every 3 born babies. More than 40 million babies are available for immunization with Prevnar 13. We estimate that there are a couple of million babies worldwide that will die from pneumococcal infections, and this vaccine could probably reduce it by 80% if implemented in all regions of the world. And as we started to study Prevnar 13, it became apparent that older age across all countries is increasingly susceptible to pneumococci, and it's a disease where there is much higher risk for fatal outcome. And we performed the first ever landmark study that looks at prevention of pneumonia as well as invasive disease in as many as 85,000 individuals in the Netherlands. We opened up more than 100 different vaccination facilities in order to show protection. And as you can see from the slide, we were extremely proud to be able to demonstrate almost 50% reduction in pneumonia and 75% reduction in invasive pneumococcal disease, which led the CDC to now, in September, recommend immunization at age over 65 for the Prevnar 13 to deal with these infections. We're also taking steps to share those advances in vaccines across the globe. As I alluded to, the impact of pneumococci may be as big as many of the other diseases we have discussed. And through working with the Gavi Alliance that addresses the most poorest countries of the globe, we initially committed from 2010 to 15 to 40 million doses of Prevnar. We have now developed a particular multi-dose vial that should make it more efficient in this region of the world to administrate the vaccine. And more recently, we extended our commitment to 2025 to provide 740 million immunization across the globe. And you can see from the early results that how a vaccine can contribute to reduce infant mortality, such as Nicaragua, by 33%. As we continue, you can see that millions and millions of babies are expected to receive Prevnar 13. So working in the industry on a more comprehensive agenda, we can make progress and find different ways to distribute the vaccines. And I think coming together in this kind of stakeholder community allow us to get global access and contribute to lower mortality and morbidity. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions for the Dolsten panel, the audience? If you, yes? No. If you pick up your crystal ball and look for example, MDG 2025, and look at what's going on now and what has been produced, how do you think MDG 2025 will change from now? We had the 2013 recently.
Yeah, I think in general to put up bold goals are very important because it challenges you to not just do things in normal ways and challenge you to think in a different way. I understand that there are some progress towards those goals, but there is a lot of more work to do. So I'm kind of careful before we see the sum up what should be the key priorities. I think Bernard Kouchner, who is active in such a tremendous organization like Médecins Sans Frontières, may have the perspective of how you see how far we have come and what you think should be the proper challenge going forward.
Thank you very much. But well, I know that meanwhile we were, let's say, witness of the progress of Ebola epidemic. Meanwhile, 1,500,000 children were dying of diarrhea. This is not the same thing, I know that. And of course you were right about malaria. What is a bit particular with Ebola is the worldwide panic. This is completely different. Because for the first time, we discovered that we were more or less all threatened by this particular virus, which was not the case even, well, the worst enemy, or the best enemy of such an epidemic is, of course, poverty. Poverty. And I cannot ask the two excellent firms, Janssen and Pfizer, also to fight against poverty. This is not the same thing, I know. But for me, it looks like if we realize in the middle of, I'm talking about European Union, in the middle of an economical crisis, not in the middle, but at the end, if I may say so, that some other people were threatened by other kind of danger. And the anxiety was so high in France that it was the front page of all the newspaper, not to fight against, not to send doctors, not to send money, of course, also, and material to these poor 3 countries, but to be protected from them. And if you are asking by a referendum in my country what we have to do facing the epidemic, they will answer, close. And that's very dangerous in such a time. For the rest, the 2 last speakers, you illustrated very well. I know the effort of Janssen, former Janssen, Johnson & Johnson, etc. And I know your efforts. And we are obliged to react on a large spectrum of very different diseases. And I was looking to this, well, two vaccines are at the second or the third, well, the state of to be tried in the hospital. One is from GSK, and the other is New Links Genetics, who is supporting financially the World Bank and Médecins Sans Frontières. You know, this is a sort of common burden. We have to react all together. And certainly, more than technically with research or an efforts of a comprehensive approach of these people. As I told you, this is absolutely difficult, more than difficult to talk in the forest.
Bernard, thinking on what you allude to, that a lot of our efforts are reactive. They're driven by fear rather than being strategic and focused.
True.
And, you know, thinking about your question, you know, what would have been kind of a compelling vision is to, you know, think about whether we could create some global emergency laboratories that would pool resources and have one common portfolio of projects monitoring through a lot of different collaborative organizations threats like these, having fast access to genome sequencing, maybe, as you said, identifying the bottleneck of the replication machinery of a virus or the need for fast acceleration of vaccines. Rather than now, I think there are heroic efforts from Bill and his companies, NIH, but it seems a little bit like they're all in a non-coordinated manner. Good funding are used on replication of activities, not through one common agenda. So maybe, you know, Bernard, that could be one contribution to create a more strategic, forward-looking agenda to deal with sudden emerging, particular viral threats.
Yes, I would add, if I might, that a starting place for 2025, 2030, whatever it would be envisioning a world without disease, and then ask yourself, okay, what do you do today to begin to get closer to that reality, whether it takes 10 years, 20 years, 100 years, but it changes the discussion. It changes the discussion from one of how do we treat some horrendous set of diseases, which I think is very important, to one is how do we understand people's risks, how do we track their progression toward realizing that risk, and how do we intervene at different points along that journey. And I think that's a very good discussion to have. And my guess is it'll take a very long time to get there. But because it takes a long time, we should get started right away.
If I may, the first step was the founding of Doctor Without Borders. The first step of the first step. But I know this is a chain, a complete chain. But you're talking about a very ideal and visionary reaction. And it was more or less the beginning of what Madame Michelle Bachelet was in charge in the name of the UN system, about international or world welfare system.
And Bernard, since you founded Médecins Sans Frontières, maybe the next needs to be Laboratoires Sans Frontières.
Do it, my dear, do it. It will change the image, at least.
Yes.
This is probably for the R&D leaders. And I don't know that this is a global issue, but what are your thoughts about furthering research in antibiotic resistance? Countries like the United States, for example. Is it more about new therapies, or is it more about changing clinical practice of how these classes of drugs are used? Any thoughts you can share on that? We don't hear much about that.
Well, first of all, I think it's more about both. You have to use the antibiotics that we have more appropriately, yes. Making sure that the inappropriate use of antibiotics is not just in humans, but in animals as well, where these bacteria can spread. And then it's going to require innovation and new types of antibacterial approaches, from vaccines to treatments. But Michael was discussing it, so.
Yeah, and I think there is clearly need for additional new antibiotics, and you know, we are trying to contribute with vaccines since we think that can have a broader and more sustainable impact. And I noted 5 different vaccines from the pneumococcal that has global reach, the meningococcal that can help with some of these fatal epidemics, multi-resistant staph that really emerged due to excessive use of antibiotics, C. difficile causing tens of thousands of deaths in this country due to excessive use of antibiotics, and beta hemolytic strep as another devastating for neonates when the mother is infected. So I think we can use different therapeutic and vaccine approaches across the industry here to help with this issue.
More questions? I think we'll continue with Dr. Zerhouni.
Well, thank you. First of all, again, this is my usual pattern. My name starts with Z. I'm last. I don't have any more to say. But Ben asked me to truly give a perspective from my point of view and the point of view of the industry on sustaining innovation for global health and what are the drivers there, because that's fundamentally what we're talking about. And I think we're a little hard on ourselves because of Ebola, and you're right, Bernard, I think it's a crisis. And frankly, too little, too late is always a problem. But let me just maybe step back and put this in perspective. I believe the world has made great progress in global health over the past 20 years. If you look at the life expectancy around the world, except for Russia and a couple of countries in Africa, a few countries, the rest of the world has gone up in life expectancy. If you look at the number of infant deaths, in absolute number, it was 20 million a year about 25 years ago. Today it's 8 million, including the fact that the population has grown. And so we are seeing progress. We're seeing patterns of public-private partnerships that are working. I mean, Gavi is really as much an innovation in vaccines, but frankly, Gavi is a financial innovation. Because the creation of vaccine bonds by a couple of very smart bankers essentially socialized the risk around the world to be able to increase the immunization rates, which is what really drove the drop in infant mortality. I think if you really look forward, you really can't separate this from what happened the past 100 years. For me personally at Sanofi, I mean, one of the attractions that I had was Pasteur, the Sanofi Pasteur branch. Why? Because if you truly think historically, one of the most incredible institutions that was created in the world was the Pasteur Institute by Louis Pasteur. And he did a fundraising at the time, which to me was an extraordinary event. He went to the Tsar of Russia, he went around the world to raise funds for the Pasteur Foundation. And in his proposal, the first thing he said, this will not be for France only or for Europe only. He already had the idea of putting laboratories, the Laboratories Sans Frontières. I think Pasteur created that. He did it in Algeria, did it in Vietnam, and so on. 10 Nobel Prizes later, we know what we have. I mean, Lavran and Charles Nicolle and Yersin and so on. So I think the models are there, except that they're too small. And then when you really look forward and you say, yes, okay, we all participating with the NDI and MMV, but the problems are not going, although we've made progress, in absolute terms, where is the direction? Well, the world population is increasing, and we're going to be 9 billion in 2050. And if you really look at where the growth is going to be, it's not going to be in the developed countries. It's going to be overall in countries like where I was born in Algeria, where the growth rate is much higher than it is in Japan. And so when you look at this and you say, what does that mean in terms of health? What it means really is a destabilization of healthcare systems. They won't have the size to do it. And it's going to be a huge population of young folks, young people, who will have to be vaccinated. We will have to have pneumococcal vaccination. Lung disease and diarrhea are still the main killers. We are developing a rotavirus vaccine and Shanta 5 in India, but those things are really part of it. Now, if you truly think about what will make a difference, and let me go back to what Bernard has always said, and Bernard is one of those extraordinary individuals. I still remember the picture of Bernard carrying sacks of rice in the beach in Somalia, right? Was it Somalia? I don't know where it was.
Absolutely right.
All right. And what it was he broke the taboo. I mean, nobody wanted to act until everything was right.
What I received as an insult.
I know. But you did it.
Yes.
And I think that's what we need. We need to really think through the ability for us to break through the inertia of the system and to transform panics into successful tactics. And I think, to me, what is really happening in front of us is the following 3 points. One, the world is not in equilibrium. If you look at the work of Nathan Wolff, who was a Pioneer Awardee for the NIH, who basically took a motorcycle and went around Africa, West Africa in particular, and measured the transfer of viruses from the animal kingdom to the human population because of economic changes. Increase in the population meant deforestation. People didn't have enough to to fish, because the international fleet from the developed countries were basically emptying the fish stocks. They went to the jungle. They hunted bushmeat. And he noticed and measured the transfer of viruses from one population to another. That is not going to go away. That is going to increase. If you think Ebola is just one accident, Ebola is the tip of the iceberg. We're going to have Lassa fever, Marburg, and 20 others if we don't really understand that this is a fundamental change in the ecosystem of the world for global health. And so when you look at this and you say, how is the world prepared to do this? Are we really able to tackle this? Are we going to just basically be panicked now, and then the next panic will forget the previous panic, as we always do? I mean, SARS, when I was in my first year at the NIH, SARS was the huge crisis. Do you hear about SARS anymore? You hear it in the Middle East, MERS. But frankly, what I think needs to be happening is, number one, I think socializing the risk is important. What I mean by socializing the risk is sharing the risk, because this is the tragedy of the commons. And these countries will have to have access to medications for free. We cannot say, for $150 a month, we're going to charge you something. We cannot. It is in the interest of the welfare of the world to do that. But how do you do this? There are examples. For example, in the vaccine industry, there is a small amount of money that's taken to put in a vaccine fund to prevent, to limit liability and compensate for whatever vaccine risk there could be. There's a French foundation called Unitaid, which really takes $1 from every airline ticket around the world and puts it together and then uses it for global health. Creative systems like this are going to be needed if you want to sustain the great idea of Laboratoire Sans Frontières, which is what I think the Pasteur model was, that we need to extend. Last but not least, that will not happen without new, renewed young investigators that are committed to this. And it cannot be a part-time job. I'll give you the example of the Gates Foundation that has had an enormous impact on the field. I was involved with the Gates Foundation when I was at the NIH to create what we call the grand challenges in global health. What are the top problems that global health need to solve through innovation? And there were 14 of them, and we listed them, and we had great panels of great experts, and it was wonderful, except that when we came to fund this research, you know what the number of scientists in the world that were working on tuberculosis was at the time of the beginning of the grand challenges in global health? Less than 200. So this is a global threat. You have less than 200 people working truly at the level of excellence that you would like in tuberculosis. So number one is human capital. And we need to worry about who are the intellectual giants who are going to really solve these problems. And we funded, through the NIH, now we have about 800 people working on TB worldwide, including what the companies are doing. So human capital is going to be critical. A continuous passion, the fact of sustaining the passion, sustaining the innovation, so that it's not the crisis that drives what you do and you don't react too little too late. We have to have clearly a public-private partnership that is not going to be accidental. It will have to be structural. And this is really what I think it needs to happen, I think, to sustain global health innovation. I think in non-communicable diseases, we are all going to invest in this because we're all touched by it. The real issue to me is the trends in the world with the disruption of the equilibria that we had, both in terms of ecosystem, in terms of the ability of the human population to travel, to migrate, to interact, is not tackled by our current plans. And I think Ebola to me is just one more example of our unpreparedness and our need to really sustain innovation. But first and foremost, the next generation of scientists, the young scientists who are going to dedicate their lives, the Louis Pasteurs of tomorrow, where are they? That's what we need.
Thank you. Questions?
By the way, Pasteur is organizing in Guinea-Conakry a center of research with the Guinean. So this is part of the answer, a little answer. But you're completely right. All over the place, we have to help them to develop such a, let's say, local and global association.
More questions? For Zerhouni?
I'm going to yell. One of the things, and Elias reminded us, Josh Lederberg wrote a book a few decades ago called
Microphone here for you.
Opportunistic Viruses. And you know, we live in a world now because of demographic changes, because of disruption in places like Africa, where new viruses are arising. And I think you're right, Ebola is only the tip of the iceberg. So we look at a future where we have unknown risks to populations at large. And I think the biggest threat in the world is the fact that as we sit, and we heard in a panel earlier about the economic stresses and the refusal to really fund things because of world economies not being able to afford it. I think the biggest threat to us in that unknown world is not just funding, and the Roy's statements all the time about funding the NIH and other institutions in a way that get young scientists doing great research so that we can understand at the most basic levels what opportunistic viruses, what other disease molecular entities are, and what approaches one needs to take at the basic science level so that pharmaceutical companies can easily translate it. Unless we do that, we're always going to be reactive. And I think it is one of the great dangers to us in the modern world.
By the way, what you just said is actually a priority. And in fact, surveillance is now possible at a lower cost because of genomic technology. For example, in the Ebola, I know from my friends at the NIH that they immediately looked at the genome of prior epidemics, the genomes of current epidemics. They could map out exactly where the epidemic started, actually at a funeral from a nurse who died from one of the first cases. So I think it's actually doable, what you just said. Surveillance of the evolution of the viral human interface is something that we will have to tackle.
No one has mentioned the role of government in this endeavor. Most of you work for private pharmaceutical companies who money comes from investors and from customers, and you have a certain obligation to increase profits. The question, so by nature, the effort in this, although you're very well intentioned and maybe and some notable examples of success, but the fact is that the government engages in partnerships with private industry all the time. The Defense Department, for example, or the space shuttle, or there's so many examples. Why isn't it possible for the government to pay for some of this work in private industry, and then so that there's not so much risk on the part of the companies?
So the very good news in that regard is that the government is stepping up, both the NIH, the DoD, and in Europe, the IMI, putting forward substantial amount of investment to help defray some of the costs of mostly the clinical trials and some of the development. Again, it is a reaction to a problem, rather than something that is pre-planned and pre-specified. But I think the very good news is that governments are stepping up. It's very good.
When I mentioned public-private partnership, Michael, that's what I meant. I really mean that governments will have to be fundamentally involved. I mean, if you look at the vaccine that GSK is developing, this is an NIH-developed vaccine. It was developed with a VRC and licensed out. I remember at the time we didn't even have the capacity because no company wanted to take the chance on Ebola. Would it exist? Would it come back? Who knows? And so we built a pilot plant on NIH funds to be able to produce the first test doses and so on. And I think Gavi is another example where you have governments really backing the bonds that are funding all the immunization campaigns. So you're completely right. The question is, this is the last crisis sort of response instead of the next crisis response.
I can just imagine that when we get exposed to Marburg virus, everybody's going to look back at this era and say, why didn't you guys do anything about Marburg?
Totally agree.
But the big problem is that innovation doesn't happen that way. And it happens, the polio vaccine wasn't Jonas Salk and Albert Sabin. It was because people were funded by the NIH for basic research, learned to grow poliovirus in vitro on African green monkey kidney cells.
Martyr Dimes, actually.
Once that happened, you could make a polio vaccine. Pharmaceutical companies could translate that medicine. The bigger fear for the future is not funding some laboratory working on disparate and innovative questions in science that we pick up on in biotech and pharma. That's the big fear for the future, and that's not being reactive. That's thinking about just an innovation, a discovery by somebody in Nebraska or Cambridge or Paris or anywhere in the world that's a single discovery by an investigator that allows us to answer questions. And that's a governmental, in the United States, it's not going to be pharma or biotech. It's going to be the NIH, and it's going to be Congress caring enough about healthcare for the future to understand that.
Well, sorry, ask you a question. I will think to my answer.
One last question. As you mentioned about medical students are changing nowadays.
Please.
Medical students are changing nowadays. They're not going into the profession for they're going to the profession for many reasons, many of which because they want to feel they can contribute to society. We talk about the need of human capital. How do medical students, how do medical schools react to going in and matching many of the inclinations of the new medical students today to fulfill some of the needs for human capital to get them involved in many of these issues on a global basis? The interest is there. How do you tap into it?
I was going to give looking for an excuse to give an anecdote to plug for the physician scientist. Many species in our business are being threatened. Seems like the physician scientist is particularly endangered because people go into medicine for different reasons, and I'm not sure are adequately exposed to the great questions of the day, the scientific questions of the day. So the anecdote, Mike Brown won't remember this, but sitting at a table with him many years ago with a group of trainees, and he said that correct me if I'm wrong, that he learned that he won the Nobel Prize while he was making rounds on the ward. And I thought, now that's a physician scientist. So I think there's great opportunities for physicians to be exposed to these very, very important questions and apply the same kind of passion to research as they did initially for going into medicine to care for people who were sick.
Yes.
It happens that I was 4 times, not 3 times, Minister of Health in my country. And so I was in charge of a very big body of research, Institut National de la Recherche Scientifique et Médicale. 12,000 persons. I don't want to say with no result, because, but they were absolutely numerous, and they were not paid enough. And don't believe that to be involved as a government in research, this is very, let's say, perverse. We need an incentive, and they need, the researcher, an incentive. And the incentive is not coming from the monthly salary given by I'm sorry, I'm a leftist guide, as he knows. But it was absolutely not the
It's okay.
Well, he said so because he was too. Well, so, you know, of course, facing a difficulty, we are ready to take a risk. If not, it was the routine. Okay, the Africans were dying. But you know, they were dying of poverty, they were dying of dictatorship, they were dying, etc. And we were not reacting at all, not enough. And for the next time, of course, Elias is completely right. We'll find another epidemic after Ebola, because Ebola will take care of Ebola. I don't know if it will take months or years, but I think in some months, even now, there is some progress now, with all the help I was talking about. I mean, with the people giving money and sending volunteers, etc. And surprisingly, on the country, on students, I didn't see too much young doctors engaged or willing to be engaged against Ebola. And when we founded this very strange company, the people were really involved, completely involved. They wanted to go, and humanitarian, let's say, not career, but humanitarian project, humanitarian mission, was just at the top of all the willingness of the people and the desires and the vocations of the people. This is, unfortunately, not completely true because of the economical crisis, because of when they were on the way to be medical doctors or surgeons or etc. They knew in that time that they had a future. This is not true now. It is no longer completely true. That's partly also.
If I just may add, it's not the medical school alone. It's also today in the US, all of these issues are really in schools of public health. And so there's a disconnect that I find at Hopkins between the medical school and its attention and the School of Public Health and its focus.
Absolutely.
And so I think this is where the bridge is not functioning right now. But I have to tell you, the new generation of students and doctors, they are more globally conscious than my generation, for sure. And I can see actually a demand, a yearning to do this. But we quadrupled the funds at NIH when I was there for global health. You know, the Fogarty International, all these programs. And we had demand. I mean, we had a lot of young people who wanted to do it. It's not sustainable. That's the problem. It's not a sustainable thing. And so I would say better interaction with the public health schools and medical school and some career pathway that at least says you have a chance to shine. And because I don't think they're motivated by money. I mean, they're really motivated by mission. But money is important too. And like Bernard said, I mean, incentives have to be there.
I'd like to personally thank Bernard for his selfless work and the selfless work of Doctors Without Borders. There is no organization like it in the world. It is just doing what we all need to do and doing it bravely and doing it well. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I was not alone.
Individuals and institutions can make an enormous difference, but the heavy lifting really needs to be done by us all. And it doesn't start with healthcare. It starts with learning at a very young age. And if I can just mention a holiday in America that's a couple days away, Halloween. When I was a kid, we all carried a UNICEF box. And I know from meeting the kids, it's been years since anyone has been carrying those UNICEF boxes. If we learn ethics and we learn to do things for others the way we can be taught and we should be taught, everyone will do heavy lifting when they're an adult because they'll learn it when they're kids. I don't know about the rest of the world, but we're not doing it right anymore in this country. And we could raise a lot of money for kids and Ebola or anything else that we need if we have the heart and the desire. And if we don't teach it and we don't start again to teach it, it's not going to be problem solved in 10 years and 30 years and 50 years because we need to start it from education. And healthcare is a very big problem, but it's only one of the problems.
Okay, I think we can manage one more question. And Dr. Zerhouni, you have been head of NIH. Do you see a need for more cooperation between funding agencies around the world, like NIH, MRC, INSERM, and so forth?
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. I mean, there was actually an organization that was created by Harold Varmus, actually, when he was head of the NIH, which is the HIRO, Heads of International Research Organizations. And I continued that, and it's continuing with Francis Collins as well, where there are regular meetings twice a year between the heads of multiple funding agencies around the world. And so it's happening as we speak. I think you can see actually co-funding of many initiatives with the Wellcome Trust, the MRC, and different players. The issue that you have is often, funding agencies are somewhat prisoner to their vested interest. And so, when you have a MRC in Sweden, they will need to fund Swedish things. And you have the same thing in Europe, where you need to fund European things with our contributions should be equal. So there are lots of cultural things that are slowly changing now, especially in the era of genomics, where you need large populations, people are collaborating. I think also that in terms of the European Union, I think there is a willingness now, which didn't exist 10 years ago, to actually share costs and share projects because the scale is too large right now. So I think it's not where it should be, but it's definitely going in the right direction. I think with tight budgets, there's a lot of pressure, and heads of agencies have to justify why they want to spend the money on some crazy international collaboration, and the Americans could pay it all. I mean, why do you have to fund anything? And vice versa with the Europeans. And so I think it's making progress. Where I think we have an issue is not there. I think is coordinated funding for the next generation of scientists. That's where we have to really, where scientists could come between a European lab and an NIH lab and exchange around the world, go from one place to another, cross-fertilize, go to India, that is not really working as well as it should be, and is not focused enough on the next generation, which is the critical aspect.
I thought your question there, Bengt, on opportunity to have more of a global funding strategy is very timely. And as Elias alluded to, that just a couple of years ago, the right framework wasn't available. So one major European agency, IMI, had a clear guidance that it was aiming to strengthen the competitiveness and job creation in Europe. So it was quite difficult for US-based funding agency or industry to collaborate. That is starting to change in a very positive manner, and we have recently participated with NH in the industry to create 3 different areas to advance medicine for the future in Alzheimer's, diabetes, and inflammation diseases, where industry and NH identify common issues to tackle and both bring funds and scientists to the table. There are, interestingly enough, very similar activities occurring in Europe. The good thing is that there is an opportunity. There are no roadblocks that stops you from collaborating. There is a positive climate. But I think, you know, your question really fuels us to think, again, it's really reactive. It's trying to put a patch over something that already has a crack, rather than design something fit for purpose. Maybe coming back to when you spoke about the grand challenges, that should be the starting point, and then build the house on top of that. So I hope maybe, you know, we can continue this dialogue, and maybe from your presence also in Europe, you can bring some of this positive spirit here back and see.
I think our time has run out, and I want to thank the panel and the audience.